Hi everyone, welcome back to MEG Motors. Today we're going to be doing part 3 of what I thought was going to be a two-part video series on rebuilding this 2004 Honda CR125 engine. We've got everything done on the bottom end. We did that in parts 1 and 2. I thought I would be able to finish this in 2 parts, but trying to keep the videos to a reasonable length, I didn't get the top end done yet. And so this video is going to be just about doing the top end. We have a good cylinder here. We've got our piston kit and with our gaskets and top end bearing already here and ready. We're gonna pull the power valve out of this and clean it up a little bit, and then assemble the top end with a new piston, and that should complete the rebuild on this engine. So let's get started. Let's get the power valve out of this and let's see what it looks like, and see if we can get it cleaned up and ready to go. All right, so here's our cylinder for this 2004 CR125. It's an interesting, this cylinder, or this bike, I guess, is a little bit different than most of the two-strokes that you'll work on, in that this one has a cable-operated power valve. Most of the time, there's a centrifugal governor inside the engine with a linkage that runs up to the power valve, and it's controlled by the engine RPMs, but this one uses a cable system to operate the power valve. But in either case, we need to get the power valve out and clean it, make sure that it's okay. It actually moves okay, but there's a couple of seals here, one on each end of the shaft, that we want to get out and replace so that it doesn't leak any more oil than it normally would. And we'll take a look at the power valve. Like I said, it feels fine, but we'll take a look at it and clean it up a little bit, and then put it all back together. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take this nut off of this end. There's a nut on each end of the shaft that goes through the power valve. The power valve itself is up inside there. Hopefully you can see that. How it works. And so we need to take these 2 nuts off. There's a group of washers on that side. And then we have a retainer right here that I believe is going to hold the rod in, so we need to take that out as well. All of this is already loose. This bike, if you haven't watched parts 1 and 2, this bike came to us as somewhat of a basket case. It was mostly taken apart all the way down to the point of splitting the cases, and they hadn't quite split the cases, but everything else was already disassembled. So somebody's already been working on this. And I'm not 100% sure how to get this power valve out. I've never taken this particular engine apart before, but I'm hoping it won't be too difficult to figure out. There's the retainer. I expected that the shaft would pretty much press out at that point, or there it goes, yeah. So I believe the shaft is just going to press out of this with just a little help. I'm going to go get a hammer and a punch and see if we can punch that out. So I have a brass punch here, which is good to use anytime you're tapping on something with threads. Just not sure if it's going to be small enough to go all the way through or not. It looks like it. All right, so there's the shaft that goes to the power valve. And then the power valve itself came out in two pieces. It looks a little dirty, but not terrible. And the shaft is also a little bit dirty, but not terrible. All right, so you see, let's work on getting there's a spacer on this side. It's a spacer right there. Fits in the cylinder. And we have two seals. I'm pretty sure we got replacements in here. So this looks like the two replacement seals for the power valve shaft. All right, so I'm going to spend a few minutes cleaning these parts up, and then we'll come back and put that power valve back together. Okay, with our power valve parts all cleaned up, time to start putting this back together. First thing we're going to do is pull the seals out of the power valve passage. And we're going to press in some new ones. Just a little bit of cleanup work. All right, and so we're going to press in some new seals. I'm going to oil them up just a little bit. I don't know if these are going to press in place by hand or we're going to have to drive them in. We'll see. I don't know. So that pressed in pretty easily by hand, which is good. I'll do the same thing on the other side. All right, so that gets our new seals in place. So now we need to reassemble the power valve, and this is just kind of a little bit of a jigsaw puzzle to get all the pieces in place and held in place while you slide this shaft. The shaft has to go through these two pieces and hold them in place. So I'm going to feed this, maybe we can do these one at a time. I'm going to try to put just the first one in and see how that goes. That went okay. Get our second half in there. Did I put that in upside down? All right, so that gets our power valve installed, the first part anyway. We need to put this collar back in. I'm going to oil that up a little bit too, make it easier to put in. going to slide that right over the shaft and push it down. You know what? I'm going to pull this back out for just a sec. I feel like I should have oiled that first. I'm going to oil this shaft up a little bit when I put it back in. Most of the time this is going to get covered with 2-stroke oil anyway, but for at least the initial run, I think it's a good idea to put some oil on that. All right, so with that in place, we're going to put our keeper back in place. Going to get a little bit of Loctite for this bolt. All right. We got a couple of washers and the nuts to put on there, but there's linkage that's going to go on this shaft when it gets assembled back in the bike. So we're not going to worry too much about tightening all of this up too tight. The owner's going to put the engine back in himself, so he can deal with that part when he puts it all back together. Okay, so that's our power valve, all cleaned up, working nice and smooth. And so now we need to check the ring end gap on our piston ring. So it's important when you put a piston in a cylinder with a new ring that you check the gap of at the end of the ring when the ring is installed in the cylinder. If the gap is too small, when the ring heats up, it'll if the ends touch, it'll push out against the side of the cylinder too hard and will seize the engine, and we don't want that. And so to check the end gap, we're going to set the ring in the cylinder. Then we're going to use the piston to push it down just a little bit so that we're sure that it is square in the cylinder. And then we can see, hopefully, the gap on the end of the ring. Not this big gap, which is where it goes around a pin in the piston, but the small gap at the very end of the ring. And according to the manufacturer's instructions, we want 4 thousandths for every inch of bore. So we're going to measure the bore. It's 56 millimeters. We already know it's 56 millimeters. This is a big bore kit. 56 millimeters, which is about 2 inches. So we need about 8 thousandths gap minimum on this ring. So let me grab a feeler gauge and we'll see what we've got. All right, so here's our 8 thousandths feeler gauge. And the 8 thousandths will not fit in the ring. Let's try a 6 and see where we're at. A 6 goes in, but an 8 doesn't. Oh, wait a minute, maybe I had 2 stacked. Let me try that again. There's our 8 again. I take that back. An 8 does fit. So we have at least 8. I'll put a 10 in there too, just to see. Oh yeah, we have 10 thousandths. So we have plenty of ring end gap, which is good. So we're going to go ahead and put our piston ring on the piston. So on a 2-stroke, there's going to be a pin in the piston. Hopefully you can see that pin right there. It's important that that pin be there. And then, let me look. And then on this ring, you'll see an N right there on one side and not on the other. If there's any markings on the ring, they go up. And so we're going to put this ring on. Just like that. So it's important that that pin is there to keep the ring from rotating around the cylinder, around the piston, because we don't want the gap of the piston ring to ever line up with one of these ports. And so that pin, let me see where it's located on this one. Yeah, that pin is at the very back of the cylinder. I'm actually surprised at where that pin is. I'm surprised at where the pin is because it does line up with a port. Which I didn't think it was supposed to do. But this is the right piston for this engine, so I'm going to assume it's correct. All right, so let me get the bottom end over here and we'll get this piston put on the connecting rod. All right, so here's our piston with the ring installed. The piston will have an arrow. On a 2-stroke engine, the piston will have an arrow on it somewhere. And hopefully you can see that arrow right there. The arrow points towards the exhaust port. And so it's important that the piston go in the right way. So there's our piston, here's our wrist pin, our bearing, top end bearing, and we have 2 circlips that hold everything together. And so for me, I like to put 1 circlip in before I ever even attempt to put the piston on the connecting rod. And so I'll work this one. And I haven't found a magic key for getting these circlips in. They can be challenging sometimes, but it's important that they get put in and they seat correctly. So you should see this circlip is down inside the groove that goes around the wrist pin hole. And so, yeah. And then I've also, another thing I'll tell you that's a good lesson is, especially if you're doing this with the engine in the bike, stuff a rag down in the hole before you attempt to put the piston on the connecting rod and install a second circlip, because these things can be difficult to install. And if you drop this circlip and it falls down inside the engine without a rag in there, it'll go down underneath the crankshaft and it can be very difficult to retrieve it, sometimes to the point of having to pull the engine and tear it down, which you probably don't want to do. So we're going to oil up the bearing and put it in the rod, and then we're going to oil the wrist pin. Then we'll take our piston with the arrow pointed forward, and we will slide the wrist pin into into the hole, just like that. Once you have the piston in place, got to put in the second circlip. And there I just dropped the circlip. Like I said, it can be challenging to get these in place, especially with the engine in the bike. Most of the time you don't pull the engine to do a top end, so. All right. So check carefully to make sure that it's in all the way. And it is. All right, so that gets our piston installed on the connecting rod. I'm gonna oil it up a little bit in preparation for putting the cylinder on. All right, so let's get the cylinder put back on this engine. Typically on the bottom of the cylinder, there'll be a chamfer around the bottom of the cylinder that helps get the ring to go into the cylinder. This engine has been bored. Like I said, this is a big bore bike. And so it's been bored bigger, 2 millimeters bigger than stock. And the chamfer is mostly gone. So this one may be a little bit challenging to get on, but we'll see what we can do. There probably are ring compressors you can use to make this easier. I don't have one. I've always done them by hand, and it's not that difficult, but you have to be careful and use some patience. And so I'm gonna just grab the ring, squeeze it together, and start slowly trying to work the piston up into the cylinder. There it goes. So yeah, it just slid right on like they normally do. And we'll put that down where it belongs. And we got 4 nuts to put on. And a lot of times, I'll tell you, a lot of times the front nuts are typically inside these openings, or there's other parts that are in the way that make it very difficult to get a torque wrench on the front ones. And so a lot of times I can't torque the front ones with a torque wrench. There are special tools. Obviously the manufacturer will have a special tool that is used to torque these front nuts if you can't get to them directly with a torque wrench. It's typically something that fits on there and projects out. You can put the torque wrench on out here, and you use a modified torque value to get those torque to spec. I don't have that tool, and I don't know if I can get a torque wrench on these. It actually looks like there might be room with a universal joint to get a torque wrench on these. So I'm going to look up a spec and we're going to try. But worst case, if you can't get a torque wrench on them, I've built hundreds of engines and just tighten the base gasket bolts, or the base mounting bolts and nuts by hand, and I've never had a problem. So I wouldn't worry too much if you can't get a torque wrench on them. Just torque them to a reasonable value and don't worry about it. But let me look up a torque value and we'll see what we can do, and maybe we can get a torque wrench on these and get them torqued to spec. All right, so to finish this up, we need to put the head back on. I already got the head gasket in place, and no big trick there. It just sets right on. Got 5 nuts. I looked up the torque spec for both cylinder head and base nuts, and it's 20 foot-pounds. I got a universal socket out, and I tried to get on these front bolts, but I can't quite get there. So like I was saying earlier, that happens a lot. It's hard to get on those front bolts without a special tool, and so I just have to tighten those down by hand as best I can. But like I said, I've never had a problem with those causing problems, so I don't really worry about that too much. Alright, so 20 foot-pounds is the torque spec. I'm going to do this in 2 stages. And again, this is another time when it's easier if you got 2 people, but I'm going to go to 150 foot-pounds first, 150 inch-pounds first. And then go to 240. All right, same thing on the base nuts. Again, I can get the torque wrench on 2 of them, but I just have to do 2 of them by hand. "20 foot-pounds isn't terribly tight, so I wouldn't overdo it, but just do something reasonable. All right, that pretty much does it. We've got some side covers to put on, but this one we don't really even want to put on all the way because there's work to be done to connect the power valve when the owner puts this engine back in the frame. So we're going to leave that one off for sure and let him put that one on. So yeah, that does it. That completes the top end on this 2004 CR125. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope it helps. If you did like the video, please like and subscribe. Check my playlist. There's other videos out there about small engine repair, and I will be doing more in the future. So keep checking back. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next video.